Well, for those who've been following me for some time, you'll know since March I've been trying to post as much independent information as I possibly can about the coronavirus. It comes from all over the world. It's independent. I don't use much government statistics or government information because simply I don't trust it. A lot of science, of course, that we get from the government has been, by its very nature, politicised, and I don't want that. So what I post is independent information. And it's from some top people, some top medical science and statisticians and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm trying to do, and I hope I've been reasonably successful. And on my website, there is now a very considerable amount of information for those who want to dig down and find it, because you won't get it on mainstream media, as you're beginning to find out. Now, I've also been speaking to a number of homegrown medics. I married to Mrs. B, who's an ex-medic, NHS medic, and we have lots and lots of friends who are medics or retired medics. We have friends who are surgeons and radiographers and physiotherapists and so on and so forth, as you may imagine. And I've spoken to a number of them, the younger ones who are in the front line. And it's quite interesting. If you speak to a doctor or a surgeon who is in the front line, they are obviously taking their focus clearly on what is in front of them. And that is serious coronavirus cases, which are very nasty. And that is what is in their mind all the time. That's their own personal battle. But if you take perhaps a view from a friend of mine who's an oncologist, or you take a view from a pediatrician or somebody within a different field, they'll take a different view. So it's really a question of what's in front of you at the time grabs your attention. And of course, I'm a research economist, so it's not unnatural, is it, that I'm grabbed mainly since March by the damage to our economy. And I believe that to be the most important thing. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Because that's my field. So what I'm trying to do here is use, if I may, a military analogy. My speciality subject, if I have one, is the Great War, 1418. And perhaps it might help if I try and look at that. And if you were to go to perhaps a frontline infantryman in the trenches in 1915 or 1916 and asked him his view, he would be very, very keen to get more trench mortars. He'd be very keen to get significantly more artillery support for his attacks, so on and so forth. Because his world, if you will, are those trenches in which he lives. But if you went to see perhaps Sir Reginald Bacon, who was the Admiral in charge of the Dover Patrol, he would tell you his priority and the priority for the world and the World War, winning the World War, would be more destroyers. So he could have more flexibility in the English Channel and the North Sea and so on and so forth. That'd be his focus, not unnaturally. And if you spoke to somebody in the Merchant Marine, they would tell you that the Battle of the Atlantic was most important. Otherwise, we would probably starve by the end of 1917. Which indeed we nearly did. It depends what's in front of you, doesn't it? And of course, resources are not unlimited. In no endeavour in the field of humankind is it unlimited. You cannot have unlimited resources. So we have to make the best of what we actually have. And even the NHS, which is an extraordinary budget of over £120 billion a year with not a great deal of audit trail, has a very great deal of money, by anybody's standards, except perhaps the Chinese army and the Indian railways. I mean, it has a lot of money. And so consequently, you'll find that frontline surgeons don't tend to think very much about money. So if you, or the cost of anything, or the distribution of resources. And if you told them, for example, that small businesses and self-employed people and medium-sized businesses were going to the wall because of the reaction of the government to coronavirus, they wouldn't think much about that. That wouldn't be what really interested them, because that's not what they're trained to think. They're only trained to think about those poor, sad, very ill patients in front of them. If you actually suggest to them that if you look at the mortality statistics without comorbidity, that they are no different over the last 5 years, and so average deaths are rather down on average, they'll be very surprised. They'll be quite surprised about that because they're not trained to think like that. And so this is one of the problems that we have. Matt Hancock, who's the Health Secretary, is now totally identifying with this crisis and no other, although he is a member of the Cabinet. And of course, there should be an overview taken by the Prime Minister to guide the Cabinet on what actually matters. And of course, he's being blown around in the breeze. And the whole thing seems to be driven by medical scientific opinion of a relatively minority group. The Chris Whitters and the Valances of the world, they're not in the majority of what needs to be done about this. So it's getting more and more absurd, if you will, and irrational. Now, going back to the Great War analogy again, if I may, it was something, of course, the Great War, the whole scale of it, and the modernity of great ordnance in the field was beyond the scope of Parliament. Parliament didn't understand what was going on. So if you look at your Hansard 1914 to 18, you'll find that Parliament had very little say on how the war was prosecuted. And if you look at the mainstream media of the day, it was highly focused on winning the war, certainly, but it didn't really have much input onto how the war might be better prosecuted, which is why we stayed with the same generals for most of the war and the same rather failed systems of attack. And we're doing the same now, are we not? And they've just got back Neil Ferguson. They've got, if you will, the epitome of the old First World War general who hasn't changed his approach at all, the General Melchett, if you like, of coronavirus, to come out with the same mathematical models which have failed time and time again. They brought him back. Inconceivable, but they brought him back. So there we are. So just like 1418, there's no new thinking. There's no new thinking going on. And sooner or later, we're going to find ourselves, if we do not change course, if we go on lockdown, which we know doesn't work, we are going to find ourselves in the ironic situation, I think, in a year or two's time, where there are more suicides than deaths of COVID-19. Think about it. You can't go on like this. We can't go on like this. Sooner or later, we've got to step back and change our game. We can't go on sending the equivalent of our soldiers over the top into the teeth of machine gun fire. We've got to change because at the moment it's draining, it's sapping the country's economy. And are we going to find in years to come there's going to be war memorials, little villages and towns all over the country, only instead of the names of individuals, it'd be the names of long gone pubs, long gone little businesses. And our grandchildren will look and say, what was that all about? What were they thinking? Were they mad? As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research based. And I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I'll automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.